Greetings, everyone. In this video, I would like to discuss appreciating classical music through the art of Tupac Shakur. We will explore some examples, and in doing so, I will make the case that Tupac Shakur's art can help us to appreciate classical music at a deeper level, as well as making the case that when we consider the great composers, Tupac Shakur was indeed one of the great composers. Let's begin with the idea of dialectics in music. One of the important features of classical music being its ability to create these dialectics between multiple poles of our experience. For example, the dialectic between doubt and hope, between distance and intimacy, between apathy and vulnerability, between love and pain, between the idea that I love the world and at the same time I hate the world, the dialectic between the idea that I love my life and at the same time I hate my life. As we are torn between these multiple poles, we find ourselves often unsure of what to do, of what to think, of what to feel. If possible, there is a great power in the ability to synthesize the dialectic. But even when the dialectic is not synthesized, there is great power in exploring the dialectic. Because in recognizing that the dialectic within ourselves exists, this alone helps to connect us deeper and closer to the reality of our own experience. So this introduction is meant to present the idea that when we consider the music of the great composers, often what makes their work so powerful is that they create and explore these dialectics, the dialectics within our own experience. Now we can begin to explore some of these dialectics as they occur in the music of Tupac Shakur. As our first example, I would like to explore the song So Many Tears. In some ways, this is a song that is a deep and very striking reflection within the self, indeed, perhaps one of the greatest and most powerful and evocative expressions of depression and despair in the canon of rap music. But what is particularly notable about this song is that it is not only an exploration of the self, but rather the song sets up a dialectic between the self and the world. There is certainly a sense in the song of mourning the self, but at the same time, there is a mourning of the world, a despair within the self and a despair of the world. And what Tupac makes very clear in this song is that those two feelings are connected and indeed reinforce one another. Our first example to explore in the song, the famous line, "Fuck the world 'cause I'm cursed." This is in itself an interesting idea because Tupac is not only saying, fuck the world, but fuck the world because I am cursed. That is to say, I am cursed because of the state of the world, and I curse the world because of my own internal state. So even within this singular line, there is encapsulated this dialectic between the hatred of the self and the hatred of the world, the contempt for the self and the contempt for the world. Another example of this is the famous line, "I'm suicidal, so don't stand near me." This again is a very pithy and poignant way of encapsulating this dialectic, a sense of lashing out at the self and simultaneously lashing out at the world. The hatred of the self and the hatred of the world are connected. Because I'm a danger to myself, I'm also a danger to you. And now let's consider this passage. And though my soul was deleted, I couldn't see it. No memories, just the misery, painting the picture of my enemies killing me in my sleep. This is, of course, a very striking passage. And in it, we can see that the loss of the self, the deletion of the soul, as he puts it, the loss of the self is connected to the corruption in the world. The corruption in the world has deleted my soul. Indeed, the corruption of the world has deleted my memories. So again, we see that the song is not just a reflection on the loss of self, mourning the loss of self, but how the corruption of the world is what leads to this loss of self. Now, perhaps the greatest passage in the entire song. Lord knows I've tried, been a witness to homicide, drive-bys taking lives, little kids die. Wonder why as I walk by, broken-hearted as I glance at the chalk line, getting high. Again, we can think back to the previous passage in which he describes the deletion of the soul. My soul was deleted. And so then in this passage, we perhaps have some insight into that. Indeed, perhaps it is less painful to delete one's soul than to constantly look upon the misery of the world. Indeed, perhaps it is necessary to not feel, because to feel would drive a person insane when surrounded by such constant misery and heartbreak. In this way, again, we see the destruction of the world becomes paralleled, becomes played out within the destruction of the self. And indeed, the deep psychological insight that Tupac is sharing with us here is the fact that perhaps the deletion of the soul is indeed a rational defense mechanism in light of living in this horrible, corrupted world. If one were to constantly feel the heartbreak and misery of the world, that would be an intolerable experience. So the rational alternative is to delete one's soul, to delete one's memories, to become nothing but a shadow of a self. As a final example from this song, here's another remarkable passage. Lately, I've been really wanting babies, so I could see a part of me that wasn't always shady. Don't trust my lady, 'cause she's a product of this poison. There are many interesting things to note in this passage. First of all, he is a product of this poison, as we have seen throughout this song. The corrupted or deleted state of his soul, we have seen to be, in part, a product of the corruption of the world. But here we see at play another defense mechanism, that of projection, as he projects that state onto her. Projection being an important theme that we will see throughout all of these works that we will explore in this video. Also, what this passage reveals, which is very striking, is this very powerful dialectic between hope and resignation. That is to say, I see hope in the possibility of children, of a family. I see a future. But that hope is impossible because the world is corrupted and no one can be trusted. Building a future with someone is the way to transcend or escape this corrupted reality. But who can I possibly build with when they are all products of this corrupted reality? And so you have this tension between hope and despair. Hope builds up, but it falls again into resignation. As with the music of all the great composers, it's this dialectic that is so charged and cuts so deeply. Moving on to our next song, our next example, the song Scandalous. Essentially, this song is about that the women are scandalous and that women cannot be trusted. But it's not that simple, because through the song, we learn that everything that Tupac is saying is projection. Everything intolerable that he sees about himself, he is projecting onto others. I think the most striking example of this is in the second verse. One of the lines that he says is, "This bitch will have you waking up with all your cash missing." And then in the last line of the second verse, he says, "Before I let her get me, I got her. Went in her purse and took $100." So here is a very clear and obvious reversal in the sense that, again, as Tupac is saying here, a beautiful and pithy description of the defense mechanism. Before I let her get me, I got her. I don't trust these other people, so I'm going to get them first. I know she's going to steal from me, so I'll just steal from her first. Of course, it's notable that throughout this song, we don't have a description of anything these other people did wrong. Any of the women he's describing in this song, all he's doing is describing his projection onto them. What he does describe are his own actions, which are the vices that he is projecting onto them. One of my favorite lines from this song that I wanted to highlight is simply the line, again, in the second verse, "So why should it bother me?" This, I think, is a wonderful highlight of how Tupac Shakur truly is within the tradition of all the great composers, in the sense that a line like this, a question like this, is characteristic of the greatest of classical music. That is, to insert the interjection within the music, within the narrative. Why should it bother me? I know it does bother me. I'm experiencing, I'm perceiving within myself that it bothers me, but I don't understand why. In this way, I do not understand my own thoughts and my own feelings. This is something that the great composers are able to do, not just to say, I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm angry, I'm anxious, but rather to explore the inner world of thought and feeling. And within that inner world, within that inner exploration, to include these questions, these personal interjections. Why should it bother me? It bothers me, but I don't want it to bother me. Why should it bother me? The fact that Tupac is taking the time to include this question in the verse, I think, is truly something remarkable and truly something characteristic of his music, in the sense that the ideas and the feelings that are being explored are not so clear, or obvious even to the person that's saying them. And as our final example from this song, I wanted to highlight the opening lines of the third verse, which I think is as brilliant as anything anyone will find in Tupac's body of work, in the canon of rap music, or Shakespeare for that matter. Just absolutely brilliant the way that he sets up and then reveals the punchline of these four lines. So it begins, dangerous and ambitious, while scheming on getting riches, I'm spitting at tricks because I'm addicted to pretty bitches. And in this, all is revealed that this was, from start to finish, a song that is all about projection. If we analyze these lines, what do we see? The first two lines, dangerous and ambitious, while scheming on getting riches, let's stop right there. That's how he's describing all of the women in verse 1 and verse 2. This is why they're scandalous. This is why he doesn't trust them, because they're dangerous, because they're ambitious, because they're trying to get people's money. But as we see in the second verse, that's not exactly true, because he's describing that he actually is engaged in those actions and characteristic of those dispositions, and there's no evidence that anybody else is other than him. So here, that punchline is fully revealed when first we have what opens with what we perceive to be perhaps a continuation of the description of the women he's describing in the song. Dangerous and ambitious while scheming on getting riches, but then the reveal, the reversal. No, I'm actually talking about myself. I'm spitting at tricks because I'm addicted to pretty bitches. Also interesting that the thing that repulses him or repels him is what he's attracted to. So also interesting in this is we see a pattern that we'll see in the other examples as well, that none of this really makes any sense. All of this is very irrational. If he hates these women so much, why is he addicted to them? So in these 4 lines, we have a beautiful, pithy encapsulation of the paradox of the self. Our next example, temptations. Personally, I think that the case can be made that this is Tupac's greatest masterpiece. If you are looking for one of the most powerful and realistic portraits of humanity, this song belongs in the time capsule. So what is this song about? Well, the persona is clear. Indeed, we might say that that persona is something that Tupac has explored previously in a song such as I Get Around on the previous album. So in some sense, this is a continuation of that persona. But it becomes clear that this persona is a shield. This persona is only partially true. There is a hidden self. There is a vulnerability underneath this persona. Things are not exactly as they seem. We see this unfolding through the course of the song. Let's begin with verse 1, right from the beginning, the opening lines. Tell me, baby, are you lonely? Don't want to rush you. I can help you if you only let me touch you. Later in the verse, even though I'm known for my one-night stands, I want to be an honest man. At this point, we see the clear manifestation of this persona. I'm known for my one-night stands. When he says, I want to be an honest man, is he at this point telling the truth, or is this another game of manipulation? At this point, it's still somewhat unclear. He's setting up that there is a duality, but it's not exactly clear at this point what to believe. When we get to the second verse, this duality and this tension within the self is further revealed. We can consider this remarkable passage. Gotta keep myself from falling, but it's hard. All the cuties know I'm under pressure. What do I do? Getting shaky when she pull the dress up and say it's cool. Should I stroke or should I wait a while? You decide. If you tell me that you don't want it, that's a lie. Again, what is truly remarkable is that in just a few lines, Tupac is able to condense all of these contradictions, all of these different dimensions and perspectives of the self. What do we see in these lines, in this passage? Well, we see that it is hard to fight temptation. He's trying to fight temptation, but at the same time, irrationally, he's making his problems worse. He claims he wants to fight temptation and that the women are pressuring him. But at the same time, even within this passage, we see that he is pressuring them and manipulating them. In this passage, we see a constant shifting, a constant pivoting from being reluctant and resistant, I'm trying to resist it, I'm trying to stay away, to being indifferent, as in the line, you decide, to being aggressive and forceful. If you tell me that you don't want it, that's a lie. As I mentioned earlier, we might be struck by the impression that this does not exactly make sense. And I think that's the point, that the truth of what he thinks, what he feels, and what he wants is not so entirely obvious and is not entirely rational. It's not obvious even to him, and it's certainly not consistent. But through the presenting of this irrationality, Now, what we have is a full portrait of humanity. We see within him an inner world that is ambiguous, conflicted, irrational, and even incomprehensible, even to himself. Notice that we might describe this inner reality as knotted up, tied up. But what's remarkable also is that he's the one tying these knots. He's not trying to untie them. He's actively making it worse. Now we reach the third verse, and the vulnerability is fully revealed. Sit down and conversate like you know me. Take my hand. 'Cause even thugs get lonely. Understand. Even the hardest of my homies need attention. Catch you blowing up the telephone, reminiscing. Later in the verse, now that it's passion, hold me tight, don't need light. I can see you by the moonlight. And then the remarkable final line of the verse and the song. Enough talking. You want me to leave? I'll get to walking. See you later, 'cause baby, I'm a player. There is, I think, a deep tragedy to this final line, that we are witnessing a case of self-sabotage. Throughout this verse, he is reaching out with vulnerability for intimacy, for interpersonal connection, and then immediately he pushes it away. So here again, we see an example of Tupac establishing a dialectic, a tension between push and pull, between reaching out and pushing away, between intimacy and distance, between vulnerability and indifference. This is, as I have noted earlier, a characteristic of all music, of all the great composers, establishing this dialectic, truly showing us how conflicted, how filled with tension, how complex, and perhaps in some sense how insoluble reality actually is. We can explore some of these lines in greater detail. Let's return to the first line of the first verse. Tell me, baby, are you lonely? Don't want to rush you. I can help you if you only let me touch you. Emphasizing here, tell me, baby, are you lonely? And I can help you only if you let me touch you. But this, as we now know by the end of the song, is a line that is full of defense mechanisms and inversions. We see that in reality, he is the one who is lonely, but he projects that onto others. Tell me, are you lonely? And what is it that he describes in the third verse as the cure to his loneliness? Is it touching? No, instead it's talking, even something as simple as talking on the telephone. But we see in the first line of the song, he inverts that truth. And so in some sense, this is another defense mechanism or perhaps a reaction formation saying, no, the only cure is touching. But in reality, what he actually thinks, though he doesn't want to admit it, is talking. So in this way, we see throughout this song, he is consistently saying the opposite of what he believes. Again, to make a connection to the art of the great composers, here at the end, we can see the full picture, the full portrait, who this person actually is in their fullness, in their wholeness. But that only occurs upon the completion of the entire work. But then we can say to ourselves, now I understand who this person is. Again, this is something that all the great composers do, and it's something that Tupac does in such a powerful way in this song. Let's look at some other examples from the song, also from the first verse. Don't be phony, because I hate it when you act like you don't know me. And compare that to this line in the third verse. Sit down and conversate like you know me. In the beginning of the song, we start out with his insistence, don't pretend like you don't know me. But this later becomes, please pretend that you know me. At this point in the video, I sincerely hope that I am making clear that only a genius could have created this. Only a genius could have created a song that presents us with such a complex portrait of humanity. Returning back to this dialectic of don't act like you don't know me, and then contrasting that seemingly irrationally with please pretend that you know me. In some sense, perhaps it's not irrational in the sense that there are perhaps two different selves within him. One of them is the persona, and the other is the real, vulnerable self. So in a sense, it makes sense. Of course, you know me. You know the persona. You know the famous rapper, Tupac Shakur. But I want you to actually know me, the real self, the vulnerable self. That alone is powerful, is a powerful portrait of humanity. But Tupac takes it a level deeper by showing that by the end of this song, there's also this relationship, this paradox, that if you get too close, I'll push you away with the persona. Enough talking. You want me to leave, I'll get to walking. See you later, because baby, I'm a player. So there's this constant push and pull. And it's not clear how this will ever be resolved. This is the element of inspiration. This is the element of genius, creating this paradox. And finally, one more example from the song. From the first verse, I gotta go. Can't be with you every minute. Miss another show. And we can compare this to the third verse, to the pleading in the third verse. Sit down and conversate like you know me. Take my hand, because even thugs get lonely. Again, we see in the first verse, the sentiment is, don't be silly. I can't sit down and be with you. I have to go. And then in the third verse, this becomes, please don't leave. I have to go becomes, please don't leave. There's more to this video, and there's more of Tupac's music that a listener can explore and be rewarded by, but I'm hoping that you'll agree with me. We could stop right here. This song is truly one of humanity's great masterpieces. A masterpiece not only within the legacy of rap music, but within the legacy of all human expression and art. Let's move on to our next example, the song I Ain't Mad at You. Specifically, I would like to point out the contrast between the first verse and the third verse. We can consider the following lines from the first verse as Tupac addresses his former friend. Now the whole shit's changed, and we don't even kick it. Got a big money scheme, and you ain't even with it. Later in the verse, and I can't even trip, because I'm just laughing at you. You're trying hard to maintain, and go ahead, because I ain't mad at you. If I could paraphrase the message or the sentiment in the first verse, I would do it something like this. That is Tupac saying, I don't begrudge you for not signing on to my way of life, but you don't know what you're missing. My life is great, and you've chosen a different life, but I don't judge you for that. I ain't mad at you. I'm just laughing at you. Also, at this point, there's also the line, you're trying hard to maintain. As in, again, there's this contrast. You're trying hard to maintain. I've got the big money scheme. My life is great, but I can't judge you. Go ahead and do your own thing. I ain't mad at you. But by the time we get to the third verse, the full portrait of this person is very different. As Tupac confesses, so many changed on me, so many tried to plot, that I keep a Glock beside my head. When will it stop? This song, and in particular, this contrast between the sentiment expressed in the first verse and the sentiment expressed in the third verse, is the work of a master composer. And by that, I mean to say that here, Tupac, like all of the master composers in classical music, present a contrast between the outside world and the inside world. Outside, I say my life is great. I project confidence and success. Inside, I feel alone, isolated, betrayed. I'm constantly thinking of death. This is the contrast that Tupac presents us with. And only after we zoom out, after having heard the entire song, do we fully understand who this person is. Similar to what I said at the end of our analysis of the song Temptations, we can say at the end of the song, and only at the end of the song, now I understand who this person is. Now I understand who this person is fully in all of their multidimensionality. And all of the master composers do this. You can start the piece thinking one thing, but by the time you get to the end, you have a different, more complete perspective. The next song to consider as an example is Life Goes On. Here, the dialectic is set up between your death and my death, and the uncertainty of how I should feel. On the surface, this song is about my mourning you. I am mourning you, your death. But really, this song is about coming to terms with my own mortality. So, in some sense, in this song, Tupac is exploring the most important dialectic of all, the mortality of others and my own mortality. And because this is such a heavy subject, a dialectic that is charged with so much gravitas, namely mortality itself, we see that there is a lot of confusion and uncertainty in how one should feel or what one should think in relation to grief and fear of one's own death. There are a few examples we can consider in the song. First of all, in the first verse, it's time to bury another brother, nobody cry. Later in the first verse, now that you're gone, I'm in the zone thinking, I don't want to die all alone. And then in the second verse, me and you, no truer two, but now you're buried. And later, eyes blurry, saying goodbye at the cemetery. Here I've just presented 4 lines from the song, but in these 4 lines, we have a very strong sense of the dialectic. After the first 2 verses, it's still unclear. How do I make sense of these thoughts and feelings? I do not know how I should think or how I should feel. What feelings should I have in this situation? I think that uncertainty is made very clear in the contrast between the constant admonition, nobody cry, and then the contrast of the reality of experience, eyes blurry, saying goodbye at the cemetery. There's also a contrast between indifference and vulnerability. In some sense, the message of this song that Tupac is essentially preaching to himself is life goes on. This should not bother us because life goes on. But at the same time, there are moments where he expresses a deep vulnerability, such as, I don't want to die all alone. And these long passages in which he is reminiscing on his relationship with this person, and then the strong contrast. But now you're buried. So how do I grieve? How do I make sense of this loss? How do I reconcile wanting to be strong with these fears of my own death? Tupac addresses, answers, and synthesizes that dialectic with the very first line of the 3rd verse in a stroke of genius, bury me smiling. Later in the verse, he also states, see, we both gotta die, but you chose to go before me. In this 3rd verse, we have a synthesis of his previously conflicted thoughts and emotions. In this 3rd verse, we have a sense that he is saying, I accept my feelings of grief, and I accept my own mortality. This powerful synthesis works only because he has first set up the dialectic, the ambiguity, the conflict, the uncertainty in the first 2 verses. The experience of this 3rd verse thereby becomes one of transcendence, a feeling of transcendence through the synthesis of the dialectic, your death and my mortality, feeling grief and wanting to accept this fate. It's certainly not trivial to synthesize this fundamental human dialectic, but this is something that the great artist can do, and Tupac does it here. Before our final example, I wanted to analyze just 4 bars, the final 4 bars of the final verse of the song Troublesome 96, as poetic and powerful as anything Tupac ever wrote. Speaking directly to God, Tupac says, either take me in heaven and understand I was a G, did the best I could, raised in insanity, or send me to hell, because I ain't begging for my life. Ain't nothing worse than this cursed-ass hopeless life. In this remarkable passage, there are many dialectics presented, many strongly charged dialectics. We have the dialectic between the self and the world, similar to what we saw earlier in So Many Tears. We also see the dialectic literally between heaven and hell, specifically the pull towards heaven and the pull towards hell. In part, the dialectic is about where is God going to pull Tupac eventually. But from the perspective of the protagonist, this is a dialectic between where do I think I belong? If we take God out of this equation, this is a reflection on where do I think I belong? Do I think I deserve to go to heaven? Or do I think I deserve to go to hell? And you can see the protagonist is pulled in both directions, is of both minds. In some sense, it's a question of what do I deserve? And in some sense, it's a question of what do I want? I want God to take me into heaven. But at the same time, we have a sense from this passage, I want God, or even I'm daring God to send me to hell. In these lines, there's a sense that Tupac is actually challenging God. I dare you to send me to hell. I'm presenting this example to once again highlight the genius of Tupac's art, but also to highlight a very powerful dialectic. Again, the reason this music, this passage alone is so compelling is because it's presenting such a strong dialectic. We can see both sides, black and white, heaven and hell, and we can understand both sides of the arguments. We can feel the valence to both poles. And indeed, that valence, that charge, is what makes the music so powerful and so captivating. But it also sets up a question. Is it possible to synthesize a dialectic? Is it possible to synthesize a dialectic that is this strong? How is it possible to synthesize the dialectic between heaven and hell? Indeed, remarkably, miraculously, this is something that Tupac is able to do. The final example I would like to discuss is the third verse of the music video version of I Ain't Mad at You. As you may know, I Ain't Mad at You, of course, was the song on the album All Eyes on Me, which I referred to earlier. But then there is also a music video that Tupac made for the song I Ain't Mad at You. And the song is the same except for the third verse. He composed an entirely different third verse for this music video. Myself, I don't know why he did that, why he chose to compose a new verse. My hypothesis would be because the third verse of the original song, I Ain't Mad at You, is far too pessimistic. So perhaps in sending this song out into the universe in the form of a music video, Tupac wanted to create something different, something more uplifting. In any case, what he creates in this verse is a dialectic between my own pain and the pain of the world, the dialectic between the idea that life is horrible, dangerous, painful, and the idea that life is worth living. In some sense, we can think of this verse as a synthesis of the themes and dialectics we've seen throughout all of these examples discussed in this video. My personal opinion is that this is Tupac's masterpiece, and I'm going to take the time to read the entire third verse. You'll see in the representation of the text here that I am presenting that I'm using two colors to highlight the positive and the negative. Notice how Tupac throughout the verse is shifting, is pivoting from one perspective to another. Life is bad, life is good. Life is painful, there is hope. One can also note that, like the final 4 bars of Troublesome 96, this entire verse is a direct prayer to God, although the content and the conclusion of this prayer is very different than the earlier song. Father, forgive us for living. Why all my homies stuck in prison? Barely breathing, believing that the world is a prison. It's like a ghetto we can never leave. A broken rose given bloom through the cracks of the concrete. So many other things for us to see, things to be. Our history so full of tragedy and misery. To all my homies never made it home. The dead peers I shed tattooed tears for when I'm alone. Picture us inside a ghetto heaven, a place to rest, finding peace through this land of stress. In my chest, I feel pain come in sudden storms. Life full of rain, in this game, watch for lead thorns. Our unborn never got to grow, never got to see what's next. In this world full of countless threats, I beg God to make a way for our ghetto kids to breathe, show a sign, make us all believe. What Tupac creates here is the ultimate synthesis. Life is horrible, and life is worth living. The future is worth looking forward to, even if it is filled with danger, loss, and pain. The entire third verse is a prayer. What does he pray for? Does he pray that God take away the problems of life? No. The prayer is for more life, simply for more life. In other words, God, you don't need to solve our problems. You don't need to make life better. But please help us to remember that life is worth living. Please give us a sign. Give us the faith to see what's next, to always keep our eyes towards what's next. In this verse, Tupac uses the line, "A broken rose given bloom through the cracks of the concrete." We will note the rose is broken. It grows out of cracks. This image in and of itself is a synthesis of the good, the bad, the ugly, the bold, the beautiful, life and death. In this verse, how does transcendence occur? It occurs by saying yes. Yes to the paradox. This verse makes me think of some other ideas that are related, namely, a quote from Kierkegaard and a quote from the Bible. First from Kierkegaard, life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. That's what this verse is about, living forwards. Similarly, Deuteronomy 30:19, I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life so that you may live. Would you agree with me that remarkably, Tupac is essentially saying this in the final two lines of the third verse? Choose life. But why would we choose life if we know how horrible life is? And the answer, simply and profoundly, is that so that you may live. As in Life Goes On, the final conclusion that is reached in this third verse is powerful because it represents a choice. It is an affirmation. It is the result of a struggle, the synthesis of a dialectic. Tupac is not just saying life is horrible. Tupac is not just saying life is beautiful. Tupac is saying life is worth living despite the polarity. Through exploring the conflicts and the uncertainty, the tension, the dialectic, then in the final lines of the third verse, he can make a choice. He can cement the affirmation, saying yes to life, yes to the future. What should one say in conclusion? First and foremost, we can say that Tupac Shakur was one of the great composers. And I would argue this point by pointing out that the great composers are masters of creating dialectics. Indeed, I would say that the characteristic feature of Tupac Shakur's music is the presence of dialectics, the presence of conflict, uncertainty, confusion, paradox. And when I listen to the music of the great composers, this is also the reflection that I see, the insight that I experience. The great composers create dialectics. The great composers help us to see and feel the tensions and contradictions inherent within human experience. This insight alone, this reflection alone, is a revelation because it helps us to better understand the true reality of our existence, the true nature of what it means to be human. Sometimes the composers are able to synthesize the dialectics and the contradictions. In these cases, the paradox becomes the solution. Our accepting of our own mortality, paradoxically, is what, for us, unlocks transcendence. In these moments of revelation, we come to understand that life is worth living for its own sake. The great composers, at their most powerful, are able to create these experiences. And in this video, I have wanted to make the case that Tupac, like the great composers, is able to create these experiences. The gift that the composers give, empowering us to accept reality, to accept the reality of our experience, empowering us to say yes to the paradox. This is the gift that the composers give to humanity. This is the gift that Tupac Shakur gave to humanity. And this is my moment to tell Tupac, thank you.